Now, for more on U.S.-China trade ties and where they go from here, I'm joined by Isaac Cohen. He's the president and CEO of Inverway LLC, a DC-based business development company. He's also a former director of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you.
So what happened? We know that trade ties between the two countries, they seem to be progressing well. They had a positive meeting back in Mar-a-Lago in Florida, the 100-day action plan to really find a way to tackle some of their trade issues. And now we have Trump with his latest decision to have his top trade official probe intellectual property coming from China and their practices. I mean, where does this go from here?
Well, actually, what we've seen after the very general statements that we've heard, based on the fact that the United States has a negative trade relationship with China in the sense that the United States buys more from China than what China buys from the United States. Now, from that general perspective, what we have seen are specific measures that are being adopted. For instance, in the case of specific products such as steel or aluminum, or in the case of intellectual property. Now, I was very impressed by the segments before because what we're starting is a procedure. It's not an outright defensive mechanism on the part of the United States. The United States wants to know what's going on with intellectual property in its relationship with China. And this will demand a study. And in case they find that there may be some issues that have to be settled,
right.
In that case, China will be put in a watch list. And that means that negotiations will start.
Now, why did Trump use Section 301 of the 1974 Trade Act rather than using other trade dispute mechanisms?
Because they are focusing specifically on intellectual property. Because if they would go to other issues, steel, for instance, steel has other kinds of problems in the sense that there are many industries in the United States that are dependent from imported steel in order to be competitive. So that has to be dealt with in a separate way. Now, intellectual property is more of an investigation, I would say, rather than specific measures of defensive measures that can be adopted immediately. There is a procedure. That's what is important.
Now, we have seen Trump use trade as a negotiating tactic, though, when it comes to politics. And in this case, he does appear to be using trade as a way of putting more pressure on Beijing regarding the DPRK. What's your take on that strategy?
Well, I think that the issue of DPRK is now, I think, settled in the sense that the United Nations has approved a resolution supported by all the members of the Security Council. And from there on, now they have to let these sanctions approved within that resolution play their way, you know. So I think that at this point, in a way, it's very fortunate, the fact that the UN was able to agree, because now it's going to be only trade issues that are going to be dominant. Now, behind this whole attitude is the fact that the United States sees trade deficits, buying more from a country that what it buys, the country sells, right. is probably one of the goals of the commercial policy. But that's something that takes a long time. You know, it depends on several issues. It's not a matter that can be settled product by product.
And that's interesting because even in the case of steel, we know that the U.S. imports from several other countries ahead of China when it comes to importing steel. So we're seeing a lot of this kind of picking and choosing of certain issues, but you have a lot of countries that are looking at these two biggest global economies in the world and wondering how it's going to affect them. Potentially, what could the fallout be if trade tensions between China and the U.S. continue to rise?
Well, I think that the fact that we are witnessing the application of a procedure here reveals that the United States doesn't want to generate a trade war or a confrontation. I think that it's legitimate. If they have questions about intellectual property, they should study them and analyze them. And if there is any issue, well, sit down and negotiate it. That's what the procedure is about. And I think in that sense, from very general declarations of, you know, resentment about trade relations on this and that, we end up with a specific product and a specific procedures, which is better than jump to conclusions and then start adopting measures that are not necessarily based on facts.
We'll certainly have to see how that plays out. Thank you. Always good to have you on. Isaac Cohen, President and CEO of Inverway and former Director with the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean.